much. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here. Thank you for a great conference so far, and I hope you're excited to have one more day. So my name is Khaled. I'm a PhD student at the University of Geneva, working with Xavier's group. And today I'll talk a little bit about how we've been doing radial velocity extraction with focus on line formation temperature. So I'll begin by giving you a brief overview of the kind of activity signals that we're dealing with. So I begin by showing you a movie of the, oh, this is very bad. Okay, but so it's a very pixelated animation of the solar surface. And what you can see here is the granulation pattern. So what this pattern is consisting of is rising hot cells of plasma called granules that eventually cool down and sink back into intergranular lanes. So if you were able to sample a spectral line across a spatially resolved stellar surface, these are the different line contributions that you would see. So if you would watch on a granule, which is more intense and moving towards us, you would have more blue shifted components, which are also more stronger. And if you would take a spectral line on an intergranular lane, you would have a red shifted component that is also weaker. And when you disk average, you will get a net convective blue shift of about 300 meters per second for the sun, meaning that we always see the stellar surface moving with a net blue shift towards us. Now, this 300 meters per second value is only like an average. In fact, if you would measure it for each individual spectral line, you would see that it's a whole bunch of different values. I think Xavier was showing you this graph the other day. And what you will see is that it's actually much stronger for weaker lines and much weaker for stronger lines. So deep lines feel convection to a lesser extent. This is not expected because we know from spectral theory that there is a mapping between the different flux levels across a spectral line and the formation height in the photosphere. So, for example, the wings are formed deeper inside, where the temperatures are hotter and the convective velocities are more turbulent and stronger, whereas the core is formed in more shallow layers. But so it's not only this that is causing the large radial velocity amplitudes that we're seeing in activity. Instead, it's actually the interplay between convection and surface magnetic fields that are interplaying with each other. These magnetic fields will sporadically concentrate in small patches in so-called active regions on the stellar surface. They can be mainly two variants, either spots, which have lower contrast and can be seen here in the intensity graph, or faculae, which have higher contrast, a little bit brighter, and can be more clearly seen in the magnetogram. They can further be divided as either part of the general network, covering almost the whole stellar surface, or clustered together in large groups that are usually mapped in the same place that spots are. So these active regions can affect the radial velocity curves in mainly two ways. The first effect is due to a flux imbalance. Here I'm demonstrating it for a spot. So when the spot crosses the surface, it will block out some light from the two different hemispheres that are oppositely doppler shifted due to rotation. And this will create a modulation with half the stellar or solar rotation period. The other effect is due to this convective motion that I was talking about, this net blue shift. It actually becomes suppressed when you have strong magnetic fields. And so this suppression will also create a modulation of the stellar rotation period. So now we know a little bit about the effects and how they're influencing the velocities. But then we should also ask, how are we actually extracting these velocities? So here, okay, this will probably be a bad animation as well. Here I'm showing you some STO images of the sun, taken during roughly a 4-month period when the sun was showing heightened levels of activity. And they are synchronized with simultaneous, or almost simultaneous, HARPS-N radial velocities. Yes. So these radial velocities have been can be extracted in various ways. So the traditional way is the cross-correlation function, where we take the stellar spectrum seen here, and a mask with the expected position of line positions. And we shift the mask until we find the strongest correlation, which is called the cross correlation function. We fit a Gaussian, and the center of that Gaussian will be the radial velocity that we extract. We can also think of a line-by-line approach, where we measure the radial velocity of each spectral line, and then we can average it somehow. And then we think that if we want to mitigate activity, we could impose some strategy. For example, if we select to only measure it on the strongest lines, which we are expecting to be less sensitive, for example, to convective motion, we see that if we average only these lines, so we choose to lose some information, but hopefully the information we retain is excluding activity, we actually get a smaller overall variability. So in my project, I wanted to take this a step further and think, how can we make the division based on formation temperature? And before I go into the details, it's good to ask, why should we bother with formation temperature to begin with? And the answer is that, so line depth, as has been shown before, is a good first approximation to probe different depths into the stellar atmosphere. So we can do what we've been doing before, and we do vertical cuts in the spectrum, and we select lines that are, for example, the deepest. However, if we take lines of equal depths, but with different atomic properties, for example, their element, the ionization state, the excitation energy, they will actually be formed at different average formation temperature. So if we look here, if you would take, this is a small part of the solar spectrum, and here I have computed the formation temperature. I will go into the following slides into detail what this means. But if you choose two line segments at the same flux level, they're not necessarily formed at the same formation temperature. And this is why, if we really want to probe layers of a certain temperature interval, we need to be in this space. And instead, we would make a more like of a horizontal cut, where here I've tried to trace like a line of constant temperature. Yes. So this average formation temperature I was talking about, how did I actually compute this? Here I'm showing you an example spectral line. And so for each line point, for each line, I can get its atomic properties. I can input this into a radiative transfer code. In my project, I've selected PySME, which is a Python implementation of spectroscopy made easy. And so what this provides you is at every wavelength point, here you can see it for 5 example lines, it will provide you the contribution function for that wavelength point. Because each wavelength point is actually not formed at a specific formation temperature, but more a whole range of them. But we can define a single quantity by integrating the contribution function and choosing the temperature which is reaching 50% of its value as the average formation. And here you can see again the inferred value here on the x-axis is the one for these points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're actually the temperature is decreasing as you go to the core and increasing in the north. And so we do this for every single spectral line. We compute it at every wavelength point, and we convert to temperature space. Then we can do segmentations in this space, where we select some interval, or we do equal intervals, and we just see how segments are differing based on this metric. We do segmentations, then we go back into flux space, and we do template matching to compute radial velocities in only those segments. And so this is the results. Let me walk you through this graph. In the first panel, you see the radial velocity curve that was extracted for this same time period as I was showing you in the animation, when we only have one temperature bin, which is equal to not segmenting based on temperature at all. Same as the more traditional way of measuring radial velocities. On the right, you see the periodogram, which shows the distribution of power, and you have peaks on the solar rotation period and its first harmonic. Then what happens is, as we segment the lines based on their formation temperature in an increasing number of segments, at first nothing special happens. But as we keep increasing, we see the emergence that the coolest temperature intervals, which is the ones given in blue and purple, are actually becoming more sensitive at half the solar rotation period. And they're also showing this behavior where they're getting inverted. And if you squint your eyes, they're also a little bit lagged. So that's more their collective behavior. What we want to do is also look at how are the spectral lines behaving individually. So here, every point in this graph is an individual line. And I want to show you how these different segmentations, here I'm choosing the configuration where I have 4 temperature bins, how these different populations of lines are differing a little bit. So let's walk through this graph together. If we begin with the chromaticity, we see that most of these lines in the different bins are coming from all over the spectrum, except actually the hottest lines, the hottest line segments, which is this red bin. And this can actually be explained if we look at this average formation temperature variable for the whole spectrum. And what you see is that it's not actually just tracing the line opacities, it's actually also tracing the continuum opacity. And when we look in more blue-word wavelengths, we're also seeing higher temperatures in the star. For the next one, for the line depth, we can see, for example, that the very coolest lines are the deepest ones, and this is again expected because they're formed from the cores of the very deepest lines. For the convective blue shift, we see that it is decreasing with decreasing temperature. And if you look at this subplot, we actually retrieve back this shape of convective blue shift versus line depth that we saw before. And actually, if we plot it as a function of, if we instead plot it as a function of this new variable, the average formation temperature, we see that we get a linearization of this in this parameter space, which is interesting, and it also begs the question of whether these convective velocities are linear as a linear function of the temperature inside the star. I don't know what the answer is to this or how different convection models deal with this, but if this is an unknown variable, this can also be used as an input in those models. For the root mean square of the radial velocities, we see that they're all actually sensitive to activity in some way and have different similar distributions. Here I'm showing you the Pearson correlation coefficient of each individual line segment with respect to the average velocity when you average all lines. So same as this green curve in the previous plot. And what you can see is that the intermediate and hotter temperature bins are weakly correlated with the overall activity, whereas this very coolest bin is somewhat insensitive. But when we then correlate with respect to, for example, the S index, the chromospheric index, we see that suddenly this one is deviating a little bit more from the other ones, being weakly anti-correlated, whereas the other ones are staying a bit correlated. And if you don't really believe me with this final plot that it's actually deviating a little bit from the others, I will try to convince you a little bit more by saying that we also ran this simulation for alphas and B, not simulation, but these calculations. And during a time where we were showing even stronger activity signals on the sun. And in this one, we also really see that the coolest temperature segments are actually more strongly anti-correlated to chromospheric indices. So now we know a little bit about the different behaviors of these different line segments, but we want to check that can we match each line segment or each temperature bin to a certain kind of active region or activity pattern. And the way we want to do this is by, we take, for the sun, we can take SDO images where we know the size and location of active regions. We can then take pixel maps and input this into a solar simulation code. For example, I have used the SOAP GPU, which was presented by Yinan yesterday. And what the SOAP GPU code is also enabling us to do is, apart from getting the total contribution of both spots, calculi, the flux effect, and the convective effect, it also allows us to segment it into the different contributions that make it up. And so what I have done is I have taken each one of these single contributions, and I have taken the radial velocity curves that I was showing you for the 4-beam configuration and correlated them, allowing a time lag of plus minus half a solar rotation period to see if is certain line segments correlating more well with certain types of active regions and their different effects. And what we can see most prominently is that when you go to hotter line segments, which is given by this red and green curve, it is actually strongly correlated with the most dominant effect, which is the convective inhibition by faculty. Whereas if you look to more cooler temperature bands, the picture is not as clear anymore. There are some lags and romantic correlations, which are also strong, but it's hard to say, to give a definitive answer of where it's coming from. And finally, I would also like to show you some long-term behaviors of these different bins. But before I do that, I'm going to show you this kind of graph. So maybe you have seen a kind of sliding periodogram before, but for those of you who haven't, I just want to walk you through this image. So let's say you have a long-term signal, but which is dominated by a long trend. If you take the periodogram for that whole signal, it would be dominated by this, which is interesting because you want to know if there's a long-term trend. But if you want to know some short-scale variations that are happening inside the signal, it's good to take, for example, 100-day windows, and then you slide it, and then you see how the periodogram is changing on smaller timescales. So this is what this column up here is showing, that initially there's a signal of this period, but then it changes after some time to this period. And they're both visible on the long time scale, but it's mostly dominated by this longer time. So again, taking the 4 temperature beam configuration and applying this kind of analysis to see how they're affected on the long term, we can start a little bit backwards this time. So if we take the very hottest beam, we see that it's behaving like the traditional radial velocities are doing. It's following the magnetic cycle of the sun, where it's having more and more redshifted during heightened level activity. It's more redshifted because of the presence of more active regions. Whereas when you go to these intermediate beams, intermediate temperatures, it's interesting to see that they're quite insensitive, actually, even on the long term, to these magnetic effects. And when you go to the very coolest temperature beam, it actually is showing this somewhat inverted behavior once again, as it was doing on the short-term scale. And what these kind of negative velocities on the long term mean is also still under investigation. So with the final thought, I would, as some final remarks, I would like to say that this kind of segmentation of line parts could help us to study activity in different photospheric regions of the star. Our most strongest conclusion is that these line segments that are formed in the hottest temperature bands are originating from the dominant convective effect. Then you might ask, okay, so if they are containing the most radial velocity, is this coolest one only statistical noise? We think that it isn't, because the lines are also behaving in a coherent way and collectively. So what we would like to know is if we can find a physical equivalent to what these line segments are reacting to at the cooler temperature ranges. And finally, since we've seen throughout this conference that the different traditional activity indicators are sometimes insufficient to describe the total signal because they have some lags and not entirely correlated, perhaps they might be just describing a part of the contribution. So when we segment it this way, they could perhaps be better suited for the partial contribution and then mixed in this way instead. And with that, thank you for listening.
So now I have 10 minutes for the questions. Yes.
This is a super interesting talk, thank you. So in addition to different lines being on average formed at different temperatures, as you mentioned, the cores and wings of different parts of the lines are coming from different different temperatures and pressures of formation.
Yeah.
have you thought about whether this can be incorporated into your model by, for example, not just fitting a Gaussian in each CCF of the different sections, but somehow enforcing that, like, the deepest parts of the intermediate temperature lines should be behaving in a similar way to the wings of the deepest lines, for example?
It relates a little bit to this last part, was that if we want to derive these activity indicators, which is coming from the CCF, like the full widths and the bisector, it could be perhaps some way of modeling them on the CCF, or some way like reconstructing the CCF to only look at these segments, and then maybe applying what is expected on those segments. But it's not so clear to me exactly how to do this. But yeah, it could be an interesting angle.
Can I just comment on this? I think for the moment the CCF is not the correct representation of what is happening on the star, because you mix the information with of different lines with different weights. But perhaps there could be a way indeed to, like, each time you have a line, you rescale it according to its temperature, and then you average all those lines together, so you are able to recover the bisector, and then you could be able to do a model to fit better the CCF, yes.
Yeah, there would also be like a forward modeling approach where you're modeling each kind of pixel of the spectrum as a combination of the expected flux and the expected formation temperature.
Is that me?
Please.
Do you think at some point you could give kind of an atlas of which parts of the lines should I use for which purpose? For a given, I don't know, type of a star. If I'm looking at G stars, can you recommend me what are the areas which would be of interest to my purpose?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, exactly. This is what we want to do next, because the way that we've been doing the temperature segmentation is a little bit arbitrary now. We're just looking at equal temperature intervals and seeing what is happening. But it would be better to have like a physical motivation that, okay, we know that between these temperatures, there's a break-off where you start having less convection and more of this kind of activity and so on. And it would be interesting to see where this kind of temperature is breaking off as a function of spectral type, or, yeah. It would maybe require some collaboration with like stellar physicists and these kind of models where you maybe have expected values of where these temperatures are, instead of me just blindly looking for them or something like that. But this is what would be the interesting next step.
Okay. Yeah, Susan?
Thanks. It was interesting how there was a natural explanation for the behavior of the hottest lines, but the coolest lines showed a clear behavior, but it was harder to interpret. And I wondered if, given that the coolest lines form right up at the top of the photosphere, it might be easier to interpret your results if you take them as the reference, because you would expect them to be essentially unaffected by stuff going on further down.
Yeah.
And then basically it means that relative to them, your hottest lines would change more, and then your intermediate lines would change a bit. But because I wonder if that's what's happening. But I guess also if you're, because at the moment it's unclear what the effect of spots is on these different lines temperatures, basically because in the solar data you've just not had many spots. So maybe in a few years' time we'll have a clearer answer.
Yeah.
But I wonder, yeah, if you take that as the reference, because
this is also something that we've been thinking about, that when you do template matching, you don't know which bin is being the most biased.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't know actually if most of the line might be biased towards the hotter bins, and then you will measure more variability on the cooler ones, or if it's the other way around and so on. So it's hard to get like a 0 point for all of these. But still, this is a tricky question. But exactly, you could compare them in relation to each other. But since we're seeing that the very hottest one is behaving very similarly to the overall line, then we're getting like a little bit of a confirmation where this is coming from. Yeah. Whereas for the coolest ones, we might need to look at like for the effect of spots, or more the flux effect, and to see if it's really in such a way that the convective velocity is starting to diminish, and a new kind of activity is starting to emerge where that one is, is finishing off.
And then that's
I mean, so it's a Slack question.
I know.
Okay, good. So you have a Slack question from Eric. The question is, this is a little tangential to the talk, so feel extra free to defer this to the after question session, okay? One thing that has worried me about the sliding periodogram is that if the periods overlap, then there is a significant correlation between neighboring periodograms, unless you have so long a data stream that you're willing to only plot periodograms for disjunct time periods. Yeah. Do you have any way to compute a threshold for significance?
Okay. Yeah, this is thank you for the question. It's a valid point. No, we don't. I changed back the slide, but it's not that. So we're not really dealing with the correlation in those sliding periodograms. It's more just as an illustration to show the consistency of a signal and when it's diminishing. But for example, unlike the 1D periodograms, I'm not showing, for example, false alarm probability levels here. So it's difficult to know that, okay, a signal seems to be persistent here, but at which point is it actually becoming statistically insignificant? Yeah, this is something that we could improve.
The color is not significant. So if you just plot the values of your color, you have,
If they are above.
still 1D but projected. So you still have the same power level. In principle, the color value behind that thing should be able to tell you that.
Yeah.
Just to comment, you do have significance levels for sliding periodogram in the paper that we wrote with Xavier.
Then we should implement this.
He doesn't seem to know, but
Yeah, I remember. With the face.
We can update these figures.
One more question. Maybe another one from online. Slack.
Was there an answer?
Yeah. So, have you tried to retrieve the error line directly from SDO data and checking how it looks, if it looks different, like at the same position when there's a spot or where there's no spot, or around the same area at the same time, to see how it changes? I don't know if
like just the error line that SDO is using to derive their.
Yeah, I don't know how sensitive the error line is to temperature, but.
No, we didn't try this. We were thinking about doing this with some other lines that were measured with in an Italian instrument. I don't remember exactly which one, where they have been imaging the surface in different wavelength points across that line and seeing the different effects of that. Of penetrating like those different layers. We haven't completed the analysis there. It's still a little bit difficult to say exactly how to convert those images to radial velocities again, especially because that's like a static change, and we are dealing a little bit more with time series or temporal change. But it would be interesting to look at these kind of other studies where they're looking at single lines at really high signal to noise, taking their different segments and comparing to the different segments we are looking at.
Yeah, time's up.
Sorry. Okay.
Thanks, Khaled. Okay,
Thank you.